If you have suicidal thoughts after the grief of a loved one and they are confined to only the desire to join them in the afterlife, that's actually not considered a suicidal risk or a sign of depression. Likewise, if you hear auditory hallucinations and they're just from your dead loved one calling to you or talking to you, that also doesn't necessarily qualify for a psychosis, but it has to be isolated to that. So take that into account. Welcome back to How to Be Patient. This is a first, the maiden voyage of Preston doing a solo episode. So thank you all for being here with me today. Margaret is on a break. She is working very hard in fellowship, but we'll be back later in the season. So while we're sitting around talking, I figured we could have a little story time. So I have some interesting stories from history that I thought really highlight some of these psychiatric illnesses that we probably attributed to, spiritual or magical things back in the day. And the point that fascinates me about all this stuff is the DSM disorders or the things that we named, they've been around forever. We changed the names of them even the last century, like ADD to ADHD. I think it used to be called minimal brain dysfunction. And then before that, it was I think they called it like dysregulation of morals, like the naughty kids in class. So you even go farther back. We've talked about this on some of the other episodes that people are possessed, they're taken over by demons, or there are ghosts around, paranormal activity, and a lot of these things have anchors in medical illness. So that's kind of where we're going today. The first story is going to lead us to a 12-year-old boy in France who thinks he is made of glass, and the next one is to a widow who develops some very interesting spending habits after a traumatic experience with her husband. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, the year's 1380. There's a 12-year-old boy who's crowned the king of France. His father, Charles the Wise, or Charles V, had just died at 42, and he's leaving the throne to his son, who he's not old enough to rule yet. And amidst all of this, there's a 100 Years' War going on with England, or there's a war going on with England. I don't remember if it's the 100 Years' War or not. Things are bad, and people are in conflict. The boy, he has 4 uncles, and all of them are dukes, which I think is it's a high up title. I don't know where it falls under, like count or king or prince, but the dukes are in charge. They're wealthy, and then they get assigned as regents to take over instead of the nephew. So, or instead of the boy himself. So the 4 uncles, they're kind of running the show, and one of them, he pillages the royal treasury and leaves to Italy to go chase a crown in a campaign. So they're spending all this money. They're kind of ruling for him, and the boy who's supposed to be king is like watching all this happen, and he develops this kind of like frustration with it, and he really wants to do right by everyone. So when he grows up watching this, he decides to fire all the advisors as soon as he turns 20 and can inherit the crown. He fires the uncles, who are all the dukes, and says, like, you guys are doing a terrible job, get out of here. And he brings back his dad's old council, and he wants to make things right again. So the first order of business for this prince is he negotiates a 3-year truce with England, and that's a generational achievement. I mean, anytime France and England can get along, I think is something that should go down in the history books. But the fact that he was able to do this at 20, it's a big deal. It's something that the previous royalty weren't able to achieve at all, and this guy's coming hot out the gate. He's like the Mondami of 1390 France. Everyone was like, oh, who's this young guy coming in here? Why is he supporting Arsenal? Oh, look at that. There's a treaty between France and England. So people love him, and his name is Charles. So they actually start calling him Charles le Bien, Charles le Bien-Aimé, or Charles the Beloved. So this guy is now 24, and he's really well liked, and he's done a lot since he came into office. I'm just going to say office because it sounds easier than the throne. Everything's going good until there's an assassination attempt. So it's not the king himself, but he has this friend, Oliver Clisson. He's a constable of France. He's roughly like the chief of staff of the army, the equivalent of that in France at the time. He's a very powerful guy, and he's like the Secretary of Defense, but for France in 1380. And there's a nobleman named Pierre de Crone, and he ambushes Clisson in a Paris street at night. He stabs him repeatedly and leaves him for dead in an alley, and Clisson barely survives. From our perspective, this would be like if somebody tried to assassinate like the VP or the SecDef. This is a big deal. And it turns out that the person who tried to assassinate him had been working with John IV, who's the Duke of Brittany. Now, I didn't know. I had to look up what Brittany was. It's a small province in like the northwest part of France, which is kind of like its own independent feudal state at the time before they were united. So imagine if the governor of Washington, if Washington State was like kind of its own independent thing, sent a guy to go assassinate the vice president, and then he like ran back to Brittany to seek refuge. That's basically what's happening right now. So the king is freaking out about this. He's like, we need to do something. He takes it personally. He thinks, I'm next. I'm going to be assassinated next. They're going to be coming for the crown, and they're going to take all this stuff down. So he actually goes and assembles a force, and he's like, we're going to go to Brittany and we're going to take these dudes out. Get everyone, mount the cavalry. We're going to Washington. Whoever tried to assassinate a SecDef, we're coming for him. But that's when things start getting kind of weird. So as he's assembling the cavalry, he's not sleeping. He's really agitated, and he's starting to worry that other people are coming after him. So he's like, who else is gonna? Where's the assassination attempt coming from? Which at this time seems kind of reasonable because there was literally just an assassination attempt. But he's like so on edge that it's kind of distressing other people. So now that it's August of 1390, and the company, they're riding outside of the city of Le Mans in the woods towards Brittany. And there's a couple different reports about what happened, so we're just going to go with kind of the more dramatic chronicler version. But a peasant comes out of the woods. He's ragged, maybe had his own issues, and he basically tries to grab on the king's horse. Says like, Charles, ride no further, you're betrayed. And then he gets driven off and goes back up into the woods. But that plants a seed. And now Charles is mulling over that even more, and he already was on edge. And then maybe a half hour later or a short time later, there's a knight or a page that's riding behind Charles, and he lets a lance slip because it's probably heavy to hold these big spears. So the lance falls, and it lands on somebody's helmet or clinks something, makes a loud sound. And our guy Charles leading the pack, he's already jumpy. So Charles hears this clink, he turns around and he goes, we're being attacked. And you all are trying to take me down. And he draws his sword and starts attacking his own guards. So he yells, actually, this is the quote, forward against the traitors, they wish to deliver me to the enemy. So he thinks maybe these traitors are my own men, that like there's a rat or something, and we're going to Brittany, so they were going to like actually, give me up to the enemy when we get there. He kills 4 of them. He even attacks his own brother, the Duke of Orleans, and he was extremely close with him. So this is all very confusing behavior. These are people that he supposedly trusted before. And then he's finally grabbed by his chamberlain, who pulls him off of his horse, and they subdue him and they take his sword away, and he immediately collapses into a coma. And this coma lasts 4 days. They call off the whole campaign, and they drag him back to the castle. So now he's sitting in the castle, 24-year-old Charles, and almost nobody at the court is thinking that this guy's going to recover. The court physicians they have around, they've already given up. The dreaded uncles who are spending all that money, they're now back in the picture. And they're like, guess what? We're going to be regents again. If you don't know what a regent is, it's basically like someone who has temporary power over the throne without actually being appointed as king themselves. So it's like, I think this was in Game of Thrones where, they had the 10-year-old king and the queen regent. So it's like, my mom's in charge because I'm not old enough to do it myself. So anyways, they take over the regency again. And they completely dismount the political revolution and they fire all of the councilmen that Charles hired because they're like, he's dead. Like, there's nothing coming to him. Until a 92-year-old physician, interesting guy, this is Yama Guillaume de Harsigny. I'm really sorry, I'm butchering all of these French names. He's summoned from northern France. And I'm just amazed that someone would make it to 92 back then. And I always have to remember this, that the average mortality or the mortality age was like in the mid 30s, but that's really heavily offset by so much childhood death. And if you actually make it into adulthood, a lot of people did actually live to pretty ripe old age. And it wasn't uncommon for, otherwise like healthy people to make it into their 60s, 70s. This is the first one in the 90s that I've read in a really old text. So shout out to this guy. Maybe he was taking his creatine. So this guy lives in northern France. He's not a court physician, but he does have a doctorate from the University of Paris. He did some med school, maybe the equivalent of a residency in Italy back in the day. He's done a lot of work around Egypt and Syria, collecting medical manuscripts. I feel like this is important because at the time, the Middle East was actually way ahead of Europe as far as medical treatment goes. They were, I think even at that point, they were using opium as like anesthetic and a mild sedative. They were performing, basic versions of cataract surgery. So if Guillaume is actually leaving France and getting some information from Egypt and Syria, he might actually be cooking with his ideas. So he comes back. He's built this reputation treating plague patients in Picardy, which I think is in Italy, and he's renowned. He's like the guy, which is what I'm getting to. This guy has studied around, and he comes up and he sees the king, and he tries to treat him with his humors, and he diagnoses him with Torble. So Torble, I guess, is agitation or a weakness of the head. And he says that he's taken too much from the moisture of his mother and believes that it's because his mom, Joan of Bourbon, had her own documented episode of madness after one of her childbirths. So she had a post-childbirth madness. And they think that humor, that moistural humor, came from the mom and descended into Charles. So the doctor in 1392 used humoral theory. He documented the family history. So good job. And then he actually got him out of the coma. Like, everyone was amazed that he even recovered. So the court actually requested Guillaume to stay on as the court physician. And he was like, nah, dude, I'm so done with this. I'm 92. All of you guys are freaking out over this 24-year-old who went mad and attacked you all in the woods. And I got him to wake up. So just let me go. And so they paid him a lot. And then he just kind of said peace. And they were trying to get him to come back, but he's not going to. So Charles kind of comes back into this temporary level of stability, and he rules again kind of normally, and then he goes into these other periods of madness again. And this goes on for about 10 or so years where it just keeps getting worse and episodes start happening more and more frequently. And then in 1405, so 13 years after, he develops this delusion around glass. So a little thing about glass is it was a relatively new invention at the time, and it's hot technology. Not a lot of people have access to it, and also it's like the concept is it's brittle. It's like made from stone, but it's not stone, but you can see through it. So the thought of it kind of being this immaterial or getting into people's veins or becoming a part of their body was not unheard of. I think Charles is one of the first documented to have delusions of glass, but actually he's not the only one. So he starts to believe consistently now, not just in episodes, that his body is made entirely of glass. He refuses to let anyone touch him. he has these iron rods sewn onto his clothing so that if he falls, he's not going to shatter because of the glass body that he's in. And then he would refuse to move for days at a time because no one can break the glass. So we went from like these small episodes to now just he's completely impaired. So now, once he's frozen, I guess he's figuratively and literally acting like glass. France starts losing in their war. They're taking on Henry V. So 10 years after the glass illusions start, Henry's army in England comes down. They crush the French army in 1420. So they have the Treaty of Troyes, where Charles manages to pull out of his glass illusion for a little bit and and is able to sign away the French throne to Henry V, and he disinherits his own son. People disagree over like how lucid he was when he signed over the throne to Henry V, but I think that's how it's going to be documented because they don't want to say that he didn't have capacity, right? And then Charles ultimately dies in 1422. His son eventually retakes the country, but only after a peasant girl from Lorraine named Joan shows up claiming God told her to. So I don't know. She might have an interesting story arc later, but we'll get into that in a different episode. So in conclusion, everyone at the time acknowledged that Charles VI was mad, but they thought he had humid vapors, moisture from his mom that was causing this madness. They tried bleeding, they tried purging, they tried prayer, exorcism, and none of it worked. Some of it might have helped. Maybe it helped him wake up from the coma, but nobody really knows. And at the end of the day, he lost the war, he gave up his throne, and he lost his family. So that is a story of Charles VI, the king with the delusions of glass. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, let's talk about what we actually think was going on psychiatrically with him. What do y'all think was actually wrong with him? Like, what's on your differential if we were to be the court physician coming in to diagnose him? Second, let's pause like we're in Dora. What do you think the diagnosis is? Okay, let me tell you what I'm thinking. And what a lot of people have come to the conclusion of. He almost certainly has schizophrenia, but some would argue maybe schizoaffective disorder. And let's kind of go back and look at the clues. So his mom had afterbirth madness or postpartum psychosis. That greatly increases the risk of inheriting schizophrenia, but it's still not huge. So if two parents that both have schizophrenia have a kid, the odds of that kid developing schizophrenia is only 15%. So it's not as likely. Bipolar, however, is really inheritable. Bipolar is like as inheritable as height. So whether or not the moisture definitely came from the mom, like it increases risk, but it's not like guaranteed to be genetic. The other thing to remember is that schizophrenia is often like a two-hit system. So if you're genetically predisposed to it, you have to have some kind of environmental factor that exacerbates it. So if you have two twins, when we do twin studies with schizophrenia and one twin develops schizophrenia, the other twin only develops it like 60 to 70% of the time. And I say only, like that, yeah, that's still really high odds, but for someone who has the same exact genetic makeup to develop schizophrenia that you cannot based on your life circumstances, that makes a big difference. So he was 24 when he had his first episode of madness. That puts us right in the range for a first break psychosis. But it could have been a manic episode, but I think it's unlikely because his primary symptom was paranoia. And like he thought that people were out to get him and out to murder him. Some of it I think was, well-founded or logical paranoia, but then it started developing into delusional paranoia, especially when he started to believe that his own men were going to attack him and then he acted on that. So if I was the psychiatrist at the time, I think we would be getting ready to, file an order of protective custody for this guy because he might be a danger to himself or others since he thinks that his own guards are trying to usurp him and he's literally attacking them. And we're seeing that happen in real time. But this is interesting. He goes into a coma, and that doesn't really make sense to me. If you have a psychotic break and you go straight into a coma, what could that be? I was wondering, is this an autoimmune encephalitis that's happening? Does he have some other underlying condition going on? But I think most likely it's catatonia. I didn't see him and I can't examine him, but the pattern that I see clinically is someone they develop a psychosis. Their mind is completely hyperactive because there's an extreme inciting event, and then that psychosis decompensates into catatonia, and then catatonia can spontaneously resolve. So that might have been what happened. The other thing that I'm just thinking about right now is so the treatment of catatonia is with benzodiazepines, right? It's actually from hyperactivity of the brain that kind of shuts down your ability to move your arms and legs. And so we treat it with these benzos that they target these GABA receptors, which would be the same thing as wine or alcohol. So I wonder if the doctor comes in and he's trying to treat the humors and he's like, have some of this wine, it will help you. Get him some beer to cure the humors or something. that may actually be a viable treatment for his catatonia and help him come out of the comatose state. Now, as far as the rest of his progression goes, he has these intermittent lucid states. So he may still be suffering from psychosis or delusions. I don't really know. I don't have a ton of details about what was going on. So that would make him still have criteria for schizoaffective or schizophrenia at least. But then he has these ups and downs where he goes into these frenzies. I didn't describe a lot of that in the story, but there are times where he would go into a frenzy and they'd try to have a whole festival or party to calm him down. The other thing that's interesting that we also I've seen progress is how things get worse when you don't treat them, and then you develop a fixed delusion that doesn't come back. So when you're in a psychotic state, you're experiencing a lot of excitatory inflammation because your brain's just firing all the time in the wrong places, but it's still firing, and then the nerves start to get frayed a little bit. So as that fraying happens, the brain starts to atrophy, systems decompensate, delusions become more fixed, symptoms get worse. So it actually makes a lot of sense that about 10 years after his first break, he then develops completely unremitting fixed delusions that his body's made of glass. This one's interesting to me. I wanted to say it's most similar to a Cotard delusion, but a Cotard delusion is a belief that you're dead. And he's believing that he's made of some other kind of material that's not his own body. So my thought is that this kind of belief that he's made of glass, it might be some kind of derealization or depersonalization that he's interpreting through the lens of his psychosis. He's having this feeling like his body's not his own. He's come to the conclusion that it must be glass because he's in this persistent psychotic state. So if I was the doctor back then, I wouldn't have humid vapors or bleeding on this. We would say schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. And then I would go out to the mines and I would say, are we mining lithium out here? Is there any way I can crack some of these rocks and break them under, a mortar and pestle and feed them to the king? It'll help stabilize his mood, believe it or not. They're gonna be like, oh, Preston, where'd you learn this stuff? And I'd be like, don't worry, I'm from the future. And also where's your Haldol tree growing? Because I need to go harvest from that too. Bada bing, bada boom. Actually, if I was doing that, I bet you maybe King would have stabilized, then they wouldn't have signed over the throne to Henry V. Sorry, England. But that's what happens when you don't have adequate medical care. you lose the 100 Years' War. I don't think I have too much else to say about that, but it's an interesting case. And I'll be thinking more about this glass delusion stuff. I'll ask my patients too. They ever think they're made of glass? May just be something to do with the new technology also. So people think that, there's cameras inside them. People think that AI can read their minds. Like delusions, the reference points don't change, but the content does. You still think you're being followed, but by whom? That's dependent on the cultural context. So yeah, interesting case. Okay, well, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Mary Ann Todd, the widow. Welcome back. And we are now moving to May 19th, 1875, with the story of Mary Ann Todd. So the setting is in Chicago. A 56-year-old woman is sitting in her hotel suite at the Grand Pacific when she hears a knock on the door. A police officer and a deputy come in, and they inform her that she's required to come to court immediately. She's been charged with insanity. There are 17 witnesses already there. They've already testified against her. There's no lawyer to advocate for her. And the trial is going to take place this afternoon, or the sentencing, more or less. And if she does not come voluntarily, she'll be taken by force. She's the widow of Abraham Lincoln. Bum, bum, bum. Let's get into how this happened. So, a little bit of backstory. Mary Ann Todd, she's born in 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky. She's grows up in this wealthy slaveholding family. She's educated very well, especially for a woman of her era. She speaks French. She's politically inclined. And she's always been telling her friends that she would marry a president one day. And they all kind of scoff at her and they say, "No, that's dumb. You're not going to marry the president. Women can't even be president. Why do you think you could marry one?" Well, I guess that's how you get in the White House, is by marrying one, but it's not going to be you, Mary Ann. That's what they said, probably. I wasn't there. So she finds this guy, Abraham, tall, charming man, and she marries him in 1842, and her family really disapproves. They're like, "That Lincoln boy, he's poor and low-born. There's nothing good coming out of that." And together, they have 4 sons, and they say, "You know what? Screw you, mom and dad, and our wealthy slaveholding family back in Kentucky. I'm going with this guy because he seems honest." And that's what she did. But then some pretty negative stuff starts to happen before there's this whole war thing. So in 1850, Eddie dies at the age of 3. Mary gets really depressed, and she doesn't leave her bed for weeks. In 1862, Willie, her other son, dies of typhoid at age 11. And this is 1862. So now Lincoln's, he's won the election. They're in the White House. So she's established herself as the first lady, but she's so devastated again for a long period that she can't even attend the funeral. She stops engaging with the public, and she starts hosting seances in the Red Room to try to get in contact with her dead child. Side note, if in the DSM, if you have suicidal thoughts after the grief of a loved one, and they are confined to only the desire to join them in the afterlife, that's actually not considered a suicidal risk or a sign of depression. Likewise, if you hear auditory hallucinations and they're just from your dead loved one calling to you or talking to you, that also doesn't necessarily qualify for a psychosis, but it has to be isolated to that. So take that into account if you weren't already thinking about it. So she's hosting these seances. She's trying to reach the other side to talk to him. Lincoln attended at least one of these seances. During the war, she's publicly accused of being a Confederate spy. She's put under a lot of pressure. Her brothers from that rich slave-owning family in Kentucky, they're fighting for the South. And some of them are ultimately killed in combat. So it's been a stressful time for her. She's getting a lot of flack in the political press. Her two of her sons have died, and the war finally ends. And it's now April 14th, 1865, and her and her husband are trying to go to Ford's Theater to, celebrate or enjoy the evening. So she's holding her husband's hand, and John Wilkes Booth walks into the theater and shoots him in the back of the head with a 44 caliber Derringer from a distance of about 4 feet. So she's splattered with all of his blood and brain tissue, and she goes into this screaming state and doesn't stop for several hours. So she's taken to the hospital, and they're trying to calm her down, but she's having a lot of trouble stabilizing. And then kind of finally returns to somewhat of a normal state. Then, uh, about 6 years later, there's another loss in her family. Tad, which was her last surviving young child, dies at 18 of a pleurisy-like illness. I had to look up pleurisy, all these like old weird medical things. It's just like it's probably a pneumonia or like a pleural effusion, like anything. So like, as you know, the pleura is the tissue in between your lungs and your rib cage. So some kind of infection there. So he probably had the equivalent of a pneumonia, wasn't breathing very well, and then eventually died. But it's at 18, so he was like he almost made it. He was like, oh man, only a couple more years, and then I could develop the delusions that I have glass in my body, but the pleurisy got me first. So that was an ill-timed joke. Also, no pun intended there either. She now has buried 3 of her 4 children and also her husband. Her son Robert's the only one left, and Robert is he's a well-established lawyer in Chicago. So between 1872 and 1875. That's when she really starts to decompensate. First of all, I'm kind of amazed that she's gone through this much trauma and hasn't fully decompensated yet. Obviously, there's like a couple depressive episodes, between like 1850 when her kid dies, and when she, goes into what they probably described as a hysteria after her husband was shot. But the fact she was kind of like holding it together is really impressive. So around 1872, she's living in these hotels in Chicago, and she develops these compulsive shopping patterns. She will go to the whole garment district and buy like 300 pairs of gloves. She'll buy multiple expensive watches in single trips. She buys drapes for houses that she doesn't even own because she lives in a hotel room. She tells acquaintances that she's destitute, but then she's also spending thousands of dollars. Turns out she racked up about $27,000 of debt in that period. So $27,000 in 1872 worth today. Let's see. So that's the equivalent of about $760,000 in debt in these like strange compulsive shopping habits. She's also spending the entire night pacing the hotel halls. She has this decreased need for sleep. And then she also starts to believe that people are trying to poison her. The city, she believes the city removed her bones during the night, that her husband's voice is speaking to her, and that she's having stuff crawling all over her. She then is carrying around $57,000 in government bonds, and she sews them to her petticoat, like on the inside of them, because she doesn't trust them to be anywhere else. And that, I think, I mean, if $26,000 like 700,000, like this is like probably $1.5 million worth of bonds that she's just like holding on to herself. Which, I mean, I know she's not in the best mental state, but Mary, like sell some of those bonds, you could pay off all that watch debt and the gloves that you got. It's probably not seeing it that way, obviously. So things are getting pretty bad. Family members are starting to notice. Friends are noticing. The son finally starts to act. So Robert Lincoln hires Leonard Sweat. He's an old friend of Abraham, and they quietly prepare to essentially take away her rights. They gather 17 witnesses. They subpoena the hotel staff, watch and glove salesmen or clothing salesmen, physicians, and they don't tell Mary about any of this stuff. And then on May 19th, 1875, they start a trial, and they appointed this counsel, Isaac Arnold, who they gave him the case that morning. They he doesn't get to he doesn't cross-examine very well, and he doesn't call any witnesses. And they bring her from that hotel room down to the trial, where they basically accuse her of being insane. The jury deliberates in 10 minutes. They find her guilty, and they commit her to Bellevue Place in Bativoya, Illinois, which is a private asylum about 40 miles west of Chicago. But it doesn't end there. That night, Mary goes to multiple Chicago pharmacies trying to buy laudanum. She tells one pharmacist that she needs it for a swelling on her shoulder. He recognizes what she's doing, tips off her doctors, and they substitute camphor water for laudanum. She drinks it and is fine. What an interesting way to address a suicide attempt. And I don't know what laudanum is. Let's look. So laudanum is a potent alcohol-based, opium-containing compound. Okay, so she wants to overdose on opiates. That's what she... Oh, laudanum. I wonder if that's where Dilaudid comes from. Probably. So I would never do that if my patient was suicidal. Be like, oh, let's just swap it out and let her do it. Like, oh, this guy's, he's gonna kill himself. He's got the gun and the bullets right here, and I'm like, just swap them for blanks. And then he like fires the gun and it's fine. We're like, oh yeah, that's a safety plan right there. I mean, and what's wild is they're already committing her against her will. They sent her to this asylum and then they let her go out. Like, can we make up our mind about where we want to land on giving these people rights? Like, if you're determining that Mary is undeniably insane, then why'd you turn her out to the street where she can go to the pharmacy and ask for laudanum? Like if you're going to say someone doesn't have capacity to make decisions on their own or competency, then they'll like make decisions for them. I don't know. Interesting move by the doctors there. So she ends up in Bellevue, where she actually gets considerable freedom. She gets carriage rides, correspondences, she gets visitors. One of her friends, Myra Bradwell, she visits her and is hanging out in Bellevue, maybe going on some of these carriage rides too, and becomes convinced that she's no longer acutely ill or was never ill as she was charged. This friend, Bradwell, leaks the story to the Chicago Times. The paper runs a sympathetic series and makes a whole story of it. And now the son, Robert, is publicly embarrassed and feels bad about doing this whole trial. Like, oh, hey, mom, sorry I told everyone that you were insane and got you locked up. Too bad it only took until the Chicago Times wrote a whole news story about it for me to actually like double back on this. Like, was Robert not visiting her either? What the hell, man? Like, your mom's lost 3 kids and her husband. You can go visit her at Bellevue. It's 40 miles away. Make the trip. Anyways, they put a lot of pressure on Robert, and then he gets her released back into her sister's care in September of 1875. In June of 1876, they have a second sanity trial, and she's declared sane. And she spends her last couple of years estranged from Robert. Most of the time is in Europe. Then she returns to her sister's home in Springfield, Illinois, to spend her elder years. She dies in 1882 at the age of 63. So, what do y'all think was going on? Let's pause while you think the diagnosis. So, the one coming here for me is it's pretty strong bipolar 1. So, I think we tease earlier is these like pretty severe depressive episodes that she has. It's hard to differentiate between like complicated grief, adjustment disorder, and depression sometimes. But I think if you're at the point where you're not leaving bed for weeks, that's I mean, I wasn't there, but looking back, that's going to be pretty close to a qualifying diagnosis of a major depressive episode. And it seems like she probably had several of those. And then on the flip side, these manic spending habits, so impulsivity, decreased need for sleep, and paranoia. So it'd be mania with psychotic features. And then probably increased goal-directed activity. So I imagine she probably felt like she was on a mission. She's buying curtains for a house that she doesn't need. She probably maybe had plans of buying a house, and then she has to furnish it and all the stuff she's doing, but it's all just nonsensical. But then if she returns to this sane state, so the difference between her and Charles the sixth is that she returns to like a normal state or a normal level in between. Even when she's hanging out in Bellevue, she's like pretty cogent. Whereas Charles has these exacerbations, but he never quite comes back to the old Charles. He still thinks his skin's made of glass, even when he's not staying up all night, having this wild episode. What's fascinating about this is that it's an interesting case in forensic psychiatry. So we essentially took away this person's rights without any due process, and she was stuck in an asylum for years. And the fact that she was such a high-profile person and that a news story would be willing to run a case or run a series on it is probably why she was released. But a lot of lesser-known people weren't afforded that luxury. Many wives were committed to asylums and spent the rest of their lives there, even if they had intermittent bipolar episodes, but were otherwise like sane and able to be contributing members of society in between. So this is I think like a pretty bad application of the law, and it's interesting to see how both the medical practice was clunky back then, but so were also the kind of the ethical and legal proceedings that we had. And the only thing that doesn't change about this entire story is that there's some shitty son who's a lawyer that's just going to railroad all your care. I'm just kidding. No offense to lawyers, but really, like, man, some people their kids just have it out for them. And I guess I would like initially want to give Robert the benefit of the doubt when he's like trying to get her committed because she is doing a lot of dangerous stuff. But then he never followed up and saw that she was getting better. And it took him until the world was basically calling him out for just trying to get his mom locked up. So I think how he responds after that kind of ultimately gives away his intentions. Well, this has been fun. Thanks for coming along with me to read these stories. I don't know. This is like usually the part where I talk to myself or we chat with Margaret a little bit. Yeah, Preston, this is the part where I talk to you. That was me pretending to be Margaret. But I don't know. It's just a time for us to hang out and reflect on some interesting stories of the past. For those of you that joined that Patreon or liked the message on Patreon, we're going to be sending out the t-shirts pretty soon. I was able to talk with Dr. Sign. He has them in your size. So I think we're getting a Prozac XL and a Wellbutrin large. So look out for those in your inbox. And outside that, I don't think I have any other big announcements. Let us know how you think the show was, if you like these stories, or if you just like listening to me do solo stuff. If you don't want me to just yap the whole time, maybe I'll take you all on a hike or something. I don't know how reasonable it is to do that for a podcast. Anyways, if you do want to see more of me or anyone on the Human Content Podcast family, we're on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods or howtobepatientpod.com. If you want to send us a voice note, feel free to drop a line there. I'm at Presro on TikTok or at It's Presro on Instagram and YouTube. Margaret, who is not here, she's at Bad Art Every Day on TikTok, Instagram, and Substack. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Preston Roche. Our executive producers are me, Preston Roche, Margaret Duncan, Will Flannery, Kristen Flannery, Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, and Shanti Brooke. Our editor and engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by Omer Benz-V. To learn more about our program disclaimer and ethics policy, submission verification and licensing terms, and our HIPAA release terms, go to howtobepatientpod.com or reach out to us at howtobepatient@human-content.com with any questions or concerns. How to Be Patient is a human content production. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more of us, or if you want to see, this is Lilac, she's my cat. She's going to be waving her hand at one of the floating boxes, which will lead to more episodes. Lilac, point to the other episodes. Lilac doesn't know what the internet is, but I swear they're there. They probably exist for real. But in the meantime, I'm just going to pet Lilac, and then I'm going to go dance in the background.